Hi, good afternoon. We'll give it just a minute and then we'll go ahead and get started on our webinar today. Okay. Welcome to Firetree's monthly family and community webinar. Our webinar this month is on how parental substance use impacts children. And our housekeeping items are just that there are some helpful links at the bottom of the screen, at the bottom of the slides, and it also includes a link for our YouTube channel, which has our webinar archive. So if you were unable to attend some of our previous webinars, I think this one is the 15th one we've done, but those are all posted on our YouTube channel, so you can always take a look at that and see if there are any past webinars that interest you in terms of topic. We also have our Q&A box. So if you have any questions during the course of the presentation, go ahead and just pop them in the Q&A box. If I don't see them immediately, I'll make sure to check them at the end. A couple months ago, we had some technical difficulties with our Q&A box, but no issues last month, so we should be good to go. I'm not anticipating any problems. If you have any suggestions for future topics, you can go ahead and put those in the Q&A box as well. We certainly welcome any suggestions that you have. All right. So our objectives for today, we're going to talk about substance use disorder briefly as a family disease, go into some statistics. Boy, nope. Impacts on children in terms of security, environmental risks, abuse and neglect, physical health, mental health and education, and then, how we can help with some resources. Okay. So children whose parents or caregivers use drugs or alcohol are at an increased risk of short and long-term ramifications. And those can range from medical problems to psychosocial and behavioral problems. Substance use can include illegal substances, heroin and cocaine, methamphetamine, as well as misuse of alcohol and prescription medications. The National Alliance for Drug Endangered Children, they define drug endangered children as those who are at risk for suffering physical or emotional harm as a result of their caregiver's substance use, possession, manufacturing, or distribution. There's a statement by Vincent Smith. He is a neonatologist at a teaching hospital that's associated with Harvard Medical School. He was an author in the article that I use for a lot of the consequences that we'll talk about. But he said that alcohol misuse and substance use are exceedingly common in this country, and parents or caregiver substance use may affect their ability to consistently prioritize their children's basic physical and emotional needs and provide a safe, nurturing environment. So these conditions can lead to poor outcomes for the child in terms of their health and their development. Okay, so the Office of Human Services Policy examined data from the National Survey of Drug Use and Health. And this data is a little bit older, 2015 to 2019, but it was the most recent that I could come across. So 339,463 individuals responded to this survey, and 86,215 of them were parents to children under 18. So in total, they looked at 163,121 children. The data took into account two different measures of substance use. So past year substance use disorder, which, they're using diagnostic criteria in the DSM, and then past year substance misuse. Past year substance misuse included illicit substance use, misuse of prescription medications, and cannabis use, although some of the states that they looked at legalized use during the years included in the study. So the table shows the number and percentages of children living with a parent who misused substances or had a substance use disorder in the past year, on average from 2015 to 2019. So that leaves us with an estimated 21.6 million children who lived with a parent misusing any substance in the past year, which represents a little over 16% of all children, and over 2 million children living with a parent with substance use disorder, representing almost 2% of all children. Of all substances, marijuana was the most common, with 12.2% of children living with a parent using marijuana. Opioids, including heroin, were the next most common, with 4.2% of children living with a parent misusing an opioid in the last year. Parental substance use has been correlated with a few family and social problems. So factors that may contribute to these outcomes can include things like inconsistency in parenting, lack of healthy family routines or disruption to those routines, unpredictability and parental conflict and stress. In many cases, children growing up in an environment where substance abuse is occurring don't get the security, safety, and structure that's essential. The lack of security can contribute to the development of psychological or emotional issues, and we'll talk about that more in a couple slides. The physical environment can also pose dangers to children, obviously depending on the circumstances, but if there's been a lack of child-proofing strategies, which could be attributed to unstable housing or parents being distracted by their substance use. So some of those dangers can include the ability to find and ingest drugs, the presence of lighters, open flames, or used syringes potentially. If the production of a substance is occurring in the home, so if, for example, a family is producing crystal methamphetamine in the family home, then there may be toxic ingredients or byproducts, including mercury and lead. Other potential environmental dangers, and we're going to talk about neglect rates in a minute, but could be things like vermin, insects, clutter, and garbage. A parent's substance use disorder and associated erratic behavior can place a child at higher risk of abuse and neglect, with neglect being particularly prevalent in rural populations. Children whose parents use substances and misuse alcohol are 3 times as likely to be physically, emotionally, or sexually abused, and 4 times as likely to be emotionally or physically neglected. So the impairment of an individual's ability to parent varies and can differ depending on the substance being used and the severity of their disease. All states, the District of Columbia, Guam, and the U.S. Virgin Islands have provisions within their child protection statutes, regulations, or policies that address substance use by parents. Mandatory involvement of child protective services helps ensure a child's safety, but could potentially result in the child being placed in an alternate living situation or with a relative or an unrelated caregiver. The data from the National Center on Substance Abuse and Child Welfare have provided this data and shows that parental alcohol or substance abuse has been identified as a condition of removal in children from the home. and that's increased almost a little bit over 20% from 2000 to 2020. The rate of cases in which substance abuse is a factor is now at 39% of cases. So, although the link between child abuse and neglect and substance use is well documented, it's important to remember it's not a cause effect relationship because a significant portion of adults with substance use disorder have concurrent mental illness, they face discrimination, economic instability, which can include financial instability, food and housing insecurity, inconsistent employment. A lot of them have involvement with the criminal justice system and a lack of positive parenting skills. Parental substance use has also been linked with negative parental behaviors that can include generally lower levels of them being involved as a parent, limited or absent parental monitoring and supervision, ineffective control of a child's behaviors and poor discipline skills, which can include the use of coercive control, harsh discipline, and just challenges with following through on expectations. So collectively, these factors all contribute to substance use and child mistreatment. So just to talk a little bit about impacts on children related to physical health, I wanted to take a minute and talk about fetal exposure to substances. So there's a ton of research and information in this area. So this is really just a very, very brief overview. But I thought a few things were interesting to point out. So the effects of fetal exposure to alcohol are really well documented. Things like fetal alcohol spectrum disorders and prenatal complications, lengthy hospital stays after delivery, and premature delivery are all associated with alcohol during the prenatal period. But because there is diffusion across the placenta, most illicit and some other substances used by a pregnant woman can directly and will directly affect the fetus. So that includes things like methamphetamine, Suboxone, and cannabis. Exposure to substances in the first trimester can affect the structure of the developing brain, and exposure during the second and third trimesters may affect brain function. Effects of fetal cocaine and opioid exposure can appear during, can appear in a newborn with the following symptoms of withdrawal. Things like irritability, poor or irregular feeding patterns, frequent crying, difficulty being consoled, increased respiratory and heart rates, vomiting, and an exaggerated startle response. Children with prenatal drug exposure are more likely to develop disruptive behavioral disorders that can include things like oppositional defiant disorder. They can have impaired academic achievement and cognitive problems, things like delayed language development, poor memory. Prenatal drug exposure, too, can be associated with increased rates of anxiety and mood disorders. Additionally, children and adolescents of parents with substance use disorder are at a greater risk of having medical problems, kind of separately, regardless of potential fetal exposure to substances. Compared to peers whose parents don't have substance use disorder, kids with parents that do have a substance use disorder are 2 times as likely to sustain serious injuries, which can increase the risk of missed time from school, hospitalization, or even surgery. And a different study found that 23% of children whose mothers were substance users were not engaged in routine health services at any point during the first 2 years of life. And, that can be, there's a variety of reasons that come into play with that, including fear of like CYS involvement, stigma as well. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. Mental health. Mental health problems experienced by children of parents with substance use disorders can include anxiety disorders, attention deficit disorder, depression, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, as well as trauma and stress related disorders. Again, in rural populations, there is a correlation with greater risk of mental health problems. So, adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, include things like abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, things that can exceed the child's coping skills and result in permanent changes to the developing brain. The brain changes can manifest then as behavior problems, violence, and health risk behaviors throughout the child's life or throughout the lifespan. Children are often distressed by their parents' substance use, and children may blame themselves for parents' behavior. They may feel responsible for a client's substance use and recovery, and that can lead to a lot of feelings of shame and guilt, confusion, anger, sadness, and anxiety. So even at not at a clinical level, just in terms of emotional function, we see impacts on children whose parents use substances. Couple that I wanted to touch on are guilt. Children often feel responsible for their parents' substance use, and they can feel like if they were better behaved, if they performed better in school, if they did everything just right, their parent might stop drinking or using. They overestimate their control over the situation and can feel a sense of failure if their parents continue to use substances. Anxiety, they can worry about the home situation and fear that the family member with the substance use disorder will become sick, be taken away, maybe become incarcerated. Children of parents with substance use disorder can be overly sensitive, can avoid conflict, can become hypervigilant about their behavior, and be fearful of making mistakes. And those two really tie together potentially in terms of a kiddo's behavior. And the last one I wanted to touch on of these just a little bit is confusion. So children and parents with substance use disorder are often frightened and vulnerable to their parents' behavior. They struggle to make sense of what's happening. They, because of just kind of a shroud of secrecy around the behaviors, around the addiction. They can feel ignored and invalidated. They can interpret lack of attention and praise by a parent as, the parent being upset or angry with them. So they're really personalizing a lot of these behaviors. I did want to touch briefly here on educational problems as well. So educational problems are common in children exposed to substance use. So that can be secondary to cognitive issues if they were exposed to substances in utero. But it also can be tied to the chaotic and unstructured home environment. Children affected by parental substance use may have high absentee rates, impaired attention. They may have behavior problems as well that can place them at greater risk for suspension or expulsion from school, all things that compromise their ability to be productive and all impacting their academic achievement. Generational substance use disorder. So, and we've talked about this at length in previous webinars, but with keeping in mind that genetics, biology, mental health, trauma, social norms, and availability of substances all contribute to risk of substance use disorder. research has shown consistently that children of parents with a substance use disorder develop substance use disorder themselves at higher rates. So um, there's a bit older research, but there was a study in 2009 that looked at the extent to which living with drug use as a child is correlated with increased risk of substance use and clinical depression as an adult. And in the study, about 1/5 of the participants had grown up with at least one parent who was a substance abuser, was clinically depressed, or both, that resulted in the child, the participants, neglect or abuse. And those participants were much more likely to develop substance use disorder and or depression themselves as they grew into adulthood. The genetic basis of the tendency towards substance abuse has also been researched a ton. Research has shown that if one or both parents misuse substances, the child can be 40 to 60% more likely to develop a substance use disorder later in life. That's from a 2011 study by Diaz-Martinez. A study based on clinical data from nearly 20,000 individuals treated for substance use disorder in Iceland over the last 30 years has shown a strong link between genetics and the risk of substance dependence. Interestingly, though, they found that almost 80% of the sons in the study lived in a household where fathers had a substance use disorder, then developed substance use problems themselves, while only 22.2% of daughters living under the same conditions then develop substance use problems themselves. So there can be potentially some gender effects happening there too. Okay. So how can I help? NPR has an article that is helping a child whose parents are struggling with addiction. So these are certainly applicable for anybody who maybe is co-parenting or whose partner has a substance use disorder with children. But this is really explaining more from an outside the family perspective. So, for the child or the children, you can be caring and consistent. Just having a casual conversation with the kiddo without prying, right? Without information gathering. It can also be really helpful to, if you're in the capacity to help them develop a skill or teach them something, a sense of mastery over something can be really, really helpful. The Mary Beth Collins is associated with the National Association for Children of Addiction. And she said kind of the bottom line is all that you really need to know how to do is be caring, to be loving, and to be able to connect with kids and engage with them. That's as simple as it is. You can kind of model for the kiddo how to separate the parent from their behavior. So this can allow the child to kind of acknowledge and feel the love that they have for their parent, and also allow them to acknowledge and feel how upset or angry they are about their parent's substance use disorder. Remind them over and over and over again that their parents or caregiver's substance use disorder is not their fault. We talked about the personalization, so it really is beneficial to just keep repeating those messages. Be mindful that behavior can be a response to trauma. So just keeping that in mind, if there are some behavior difficulties or challenges, being able to kind of take a moment to consider where this might be coming from. Assisting kiddos with developing healthy coping skills that they can use to manage those emotions. Things that may or may not be being modeled at home. And oh my gosh, look at my numbering. Sorry. And letting kids be kids. So a lot of kiddos can take on a caregiver role to take care of their parent with a substance use disorder. So just encouraging them to have age-appropriate behaviors, to be silly and fun, and step away from that kind of like pseudo parental role that they can put themselves in. Okay. And lastly, some additional resources. So I found this repeatedly in a couple different areas. It's the 7 C's that was developed by a staff member at the Hazelden Betty Ford Center. As kind of like a mantra that they teach to children in this circumstance. I didn't cause it, I can't control it, I can't cure it, but I can help take care of myself by communicating my feelings, making healthy choices, and celebrating me. So I thought that was really cool, and I saw that, like I said, multiple different areas. There are a whole bunch of resources at the National Association for Children of Addiction. Similarly, for support groups, a mutual support group is Al-Anon or Alateen. Again, there's support meetings, there are resources available on that website as well. And I did want to point out, if maybe you're less familiar with Al-Anon as a group, that it focuses on bringing about positive change to the family member's individual situation, kind of regardless of whether the person with the substance use disorder gets help, is sober, is in recovery, or if they're continuing to use. And for younger kiddos, I found this resource too that is, there's just a ton of stuff. I was really surprised, but the Sesame Workshop, like Sesame Street, and they have resources to offer hope and support to children and families coping with challenges of parental addiction. So they have videos about maybe how to model that conversation, age-appropriate ways to have conversations about substance use disorder or family addiction. And, you know, I encourage you to check that out as a resource, particularly for younger kiddos. So with that, we'll take a minute here. If anybody has any questions, pop them into the Q&A box. I have not seen any come through. Hopefully it's working. Okay. Otherwise, thank you for joining me this afternoon on, Thanksgiving week. I really appreciate your time. Hopefully something was interesting to you from the presentation, or you learned something today. Our next webinar is scheduled for December 19th at 12. And the topic is identified. Our topic for next month is kind of generally supporting a loved one in recovery. So hopefully we'll see you in a few weeks. All righty. Thanks so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you in December for our webinar. Thank you.